getting big dick right now. Shoot!
But there's a difference already in how Charles is absorbing the shots.
No, Bryce Mitchell absorbed the time.
To learn the fact that Charles Oliveira is my favorite fighter in the UFC. Charles and I, honestly, I have known him, I've met him, and I have been able to cultivate a relationship with him over the past few years. And I think that when I had first met Charles Oliveira, I was at a point in my life where I just didn't see the point of it all. You know, I think that it's very easy to get crushed, to get burdened under the weight, under the magnitude of what it means to be a human.
So, much to the dismay of MMA Che and all those casual Oliveira fans on Mojahat's channel who thought that Chinny Charles had a chance, Ilia has shocked the world again by vaporizing what was left of Do Bronx's jaw. Ilia Topuria, who is undefeated at 17-0, is a 2-division champion, and he has now beaten Volkanovski, Holloway, and Charles Oliveira all in a row, which is undoubtedly the best 3-fight win streak in UFC history. And not only that, each KO has been more devastating, more brutal, and more upsetting for fans who started watching the sport during COVID than the previous one. I mean, his wins are so good that they even sobered up Conor McGregor. But now that Ilia Topuria is the lightweight champion, I don't think anybody would disagree with me when I say that Ilia Topuria has a really, really good shot at becoming the greatest mixed martial artist of all time. And when I say greatest, I mean the greatest. Greater than Mighty Mouse. Greater than St. Pierre. And yes, if we also count fighters who have failed multiple drug tests, greater than John Jones. I hate you! And personally speaking, I believe Ilia Topuria will become the GOAT of this sport. But before I lay out why I think Ilia will make it that far, let's go over the consequences of Ilia's victory over Charles. Immediately after Ilia's right hook landed on Charles' chin, which is the MMA equivalent of hydrogen bomb versus coughing baby, Joe Rogan called Paddy Pimblett into the cage. Ilia faced off with Paddy said Ilia couldn't knock him out, and then Ilia pushed him away. And as I said in my previous video where I explained why the UFC needed Ilia Topuria to KO Charles Oliveira, Topuria versus Pimblett is the second biggest fight that the UFC can make at lightweight after Topuria versus Makhachev. However, what's bizarre about this face-off is that, as Dana White said here,
Ilia, after the fight, he called in Paddy Pimblett and brought him into the cage, and they had a face-off. Obviously, they've got a long history together. I know there's a lot of options on the table for Ilia, but when he shows that type of interest in a fight, does that make you want to make it?
Well, I don't know who the hell let him in there. That should have never happened. Let's start there. I was already back in my room, or that would have never happened. But
these two really weren't supposed to face off in the octagon. But, as Ilia said here in his post-fight presser,
but with Paddy, I'm really gonna enjoy kicking his ass.
Ilia Topuria really wants that fight now. And personally speaking, I think that the UFC will book Topuria versus Pimblett before the end of the year, contrary to the wishes of Dana White. And here's why. First, in addition to that fight being the biggest one that the UFC could book at this current moment, it's a fight that could easily be lost. If the UFC were to make Pimblett versus Gaethje, Pimblett versus Arman, or Pimblett versus Hooker as a #1 contender fight, Pimblett has a decent chance of losing in all of those fights. And if Ilia were to be booked against the rightful #1 contender, Arman Tsarukyan, there is a chance, however slim, that Ilia loses, which I'll discuss later when breaking down how Ilia matches up against the rest of the lightweight division. So, from the UFC's perspective, why not make the fight right now when both of these guys are coming off a win? Then, the second reason why I think the UFC will book Topuria versus Pimblett is because even though Dana White may have not wanted those two to square off, Dana White doesn't really run the day-to-day operations of the UFC anymore. Dana White nowadays is mostly concerned with promoting power slap and boxing over the UFC, and doesn't seem to really care that much about the company anymore. And as I said in my previous video, remember that it was Hunter Campbell who went to Dagestan to negotiate with Islam Makhachev about giving up the belt before moving up to welterweight. The third reason why the UFC will book this fight is because it is a win-win situation for them. If Ilia wins, his star power grows even more than it has now. If Paddy wins, then Paddy becomes a megastar, and potential fights with Islam Makhachev and an Ilia Topuria rematch both become incredibly intriguing. There is no bad outcome for the UFC like there would be in a matchup between Topuria vs Tsarukyan or Topuria vs Gaethje. And finally, this fight lines up the best timeline-wise. Ilia has said that he can fight once more before the end of the year, and Paddy has had time to recover from any nagging injuries from the Chandler fight. So yes, I believe this fight may be booked for UFC 322 or UFC 323, around early November or December. Now, as for why I believe Ilia Topuria will become the greatest mixed martial artist of all time, I think it comes down to this. Topuria not only is an incredibly talented fighter, but he has also become lightweight champion at the perfect time. If you look at the current possible title contenders for Ilia Topuria, they are as follows: Paddy Pimblett, Arman Tsarukyan, Justin Gaethje, Dan Hooker, and the winner of Max Holloway vs Dustin Poirier, if Max Holloway wins. Paddy hasn't faced elite level competition in the UFC yet, let alone anybody who is even remotely close to Ilia's level. Justin Gaethje is 37 years old, can't wrestle, and got brutally slept by the man who Ilia brutally slept. Dan Hooker is 35, won a really close split decision against Gamrot, and is constantly injuring his fists. And then Max Holloway, well, we all know how that fight went down at featherweight. The only fight that poses any danger whatsoever to Ilia Topuria out of these 5 options is Arman Tsarukyan, and Arman is getting sidelined by the UFC for pulling out of UFC 311, and because he likely doesn't have the star power of Topuria or Pimblett. So right now, Ilia has the potential to rack up multiple title defenses against competition that is either inexperienced at the championship level or aging out. Basically, what I'm saying is that I can very easily see Ilia Topuria surpassing Islam Makhachev's record for the most lightweight title defenses if it's against the competition that's currently around. However, that's all without mentioning the elephant in the room, which is the potential fight between Ilia Topuria and Islam Makhachev himself. Now, there's a solid chance that that fight may not happen. Islam and Jack Della Maddalena should fight each other before the end of this year, during which time I think Ilia vs Pimblett will also happen. But regardless of who wins between Islam and JDM, I think the mere fact that the fight is happening benefits Ilia Topuria. If Islam beats JDM, there's a solid chance that Islam stays at 170 pounds for the rest of his career. Although Islam has said that he wants to go back down to fight at lightweight, he's currently in the process of bulking up, and I doubt he'd like to do an extra hard weight cut just to fight Topuria. But if JDM beats Islam, which by the way I think is going to happen, JDM by round 2 TKO, it's very likely that Islam will go down to lightweight for an immediate title shot so that he can attempt to reclaim his belt against Ilia. And that will give Ilia a chance to fight Islam Makhachev at his weakest. Coming off a loss, cutting more weight, and with some possible damage if Islam gets dropped or even knocked out by JDM. So if Islam wins, Ilia will be able to avoid the toughest possible matchup for him at 155 pounds. And if Islam loses, Ilia will probably be fighting a version of Islam that has been softened up by Jack. Both outcomes benefit Ilia, with one option letting him rack up easy title defenses, and the other letting him get a shot at beating the greatest lightweight of all time in a potentially compromised state. Now, to end this video off, I'll just briefly go over how I think Ilia matches up against the rest of the division. Starting off with the Unks, I'd say Justin Gaethje and Dan Hooker both get KO'd in the first round. Personally, I think both of these guys will get finished with a left hook to the body if Ilia were to fight them, since they both have a weakness to body shots. They're also old and battle-worn, and honestly, I don't know how much longer their chins will hold up. Then, if Max were to rematch Ilia for the title, I think that fight goes the same way that it did at featherweight. Although I could see Ilia mixing and grappling to submit Max, just to prove a point. As for Arman and Islam Makhachev, those two are the hardest matchups for Ilia Topuria. But they aren't the hardest matchups for the reason that you might initially think. Arman and Islam are the two best grapplers who could fight Ilia. But, as we just saw in his fight with Oliveira, Ilia's grappling is just as good as theirs, if not potentially better. Ilia threw Oliveira from the 50-50 position, passed Oliveira's guard while Oliveira wasn't rocked, put him in a crucifix, and then escaped from a leg entanglement without any issues. So instead of their grappling, the reason why Arman and Islam will be the toughest matchups for Ilia Topuria is because of their kicks. Arman and Islam both have good kicks to the head and body, which is what I think would be the most challenging strikes for Ilia to deal with on the feet. First off, the only time we have seen Ilia in any kind of trouble was when he got dropped by Jai Herbert, although he has gotten exponentially better since that fight. But the main reason why those kicks may be an issue for Topuria is because making him block may damage his arms, which could then, conceivably, compromise his power. But still, I think Topuria could win by KO or by decision against both of them. And if Islam gets KO'd up at welterweight by JDM and then comes down to lightweight to fight Ilia Topuria, I will absolutely pick Topuria to win by knockout. And finally, as for Paddy Pimblett, I think he may be able to survive to a decision against Ilia. Albeit, that decision will look like the decision that Ilia had against Josh Emmett, where he 50-42'd him. And it's only because Paddy is durable and would likely kick at range like Arman and Islam would. Not because I think he'll have any significant success against Topuria. But anyways, that's the end of this video. Sorry for not uploading as much recently. I'm just about to get a new computer which will help me make videos faster, and I'll also be releasing another research-based long-form video in around the next week or so. So yeah, goodbye. And I'm giving you 5 seconds to click off if you don't want the ads to play.